Hello, and thank you for joining us on the Happiness Quest today. My name is Jess Dutel, and I'm from the Center for Transformation at Plymouth State University.
And I am Maria Sanders, a philosophy professor at Plymouth State University and CEO on Philosophy for Life. So today on the Happiness Quest show, we're going to talk about worry, the impact that worrying has on happiness. And as I was preparing for the show, I pulled a quote that I thought you would enjoy.
I know I'm going to. I am a worry wart, so this is going to be a fun show for me.
Well, this is actually from a blog, and I'm not familiar with the author, Michael Miles, and the site was Pick the Brain, Grow Yourself. It didn't read like a scientific site, so take that with a grain of salt, but I liked this quote from the standpoint that I think this captures at least what I've heard most recently people express about worry. So it's one view on worry. And again, this is Michael Miles. Worry is a great destroyer of happiness. It is totally unproductive. It's an unproductive thing to do, and yet most of us engage in it with great enthusiasm. I'm always amused when I hear things like, is this something we should worry about? Or what should we really be worrying about? The answer, of course, is that we shouldn't be worrying about anything. There is always a better option. Now, as appealing as that initially sounds, I'm not sure I agree that all worrying is bad. And so why don't we start there? When you think about worrying, you said you're a self-proclaimed worrywart.
Absolutely.
Is all worrying bad, or does it at times work to your benefit?
Well, let me start by saying I worry about worrying too much.
So you have it at the extreme.
Yes, and it's genetic. It runs in my family. My grandmother was a full-fledged worrywart, so I get that from her. But I do think there's this aspect that's beneficial in terms of caring about something and being concerned about something, right?
So you're vested in it.
You're vested in it. I worry the most probably about my 3 children. And a lot of parents spend some time worrying.
Right.
Now, if I didn't worry about them at all, that would be perplexing, right? I mean, that wouldn't necessarily be a good thing.
Like a sign of lack of caring if there's
Yeah.
no worrying at all.
Yeah.
And maybe worry itself has taken on this negative connotation that maybe it's concern.
Maybe it's concern. But when worry goes from being concerned to truly, I think what we're talking about, what this author is talking about, worrying in terms of what can I do about it? Is this in my control? Can I change anything? And if not, worrying for worry's sake, and of course I'm preaching to myself here because I am the worrywart, but worrying for the sake of worrying about things that you can't control, that you cannot change and you cannot necessarily take action on, then that can be pretty damaging, in my experience.
Well, it definitely detracts from our energy level. It is not productive in many cases, so it kind of consumes time that we could be using in a more productive way. But at the same time, I think there are a couple assumptions that are being made, at least in this initial statement as well. One being, what do we mean by happiness? Because I know we've spoken several times on previous shows that there are these different definitions for happiness.
Sure.
This feels like the author, when he says it's the great destroyer of happiness, that it feels like happiness is being viewed as pleasure or a feeling. Definitely, I think about when I worry, it doesn't feel good.
No.
And that's maybe in part why we have this negative connotation around it. It doesn't feel good to us. It seems like, okay, if I'm thinking of pleasure, this is more of a painful undertaking. And yet at the same time, it's probably an overstatement to just view worrying as negative because it can be a motivator. It can kind of set us towards problem solving, towards figuring out, well, what is the real source of this worry? And I think this is key. What, if anything, can I do about it?
Right. It can move you to action.
Exactly.
Right?
And I think all too often, though, we allow the worrying itself to ruminate, and we're not going anywhere. It's almost like we're spinning just in this state of worry. That's not productive.
And that is what feels negative, for sure, when you're stuck in the worry and you can't get out of it. And it can honestly become paralyzing And that's when it becomes anxiety, right? It's not just worrying about something.
Right. You know, I pulled a quote from Mark Twain. I seem to be on a quote thing today, but I pulled a quote from Mark Twain that I absolutely love. He says, "I am an old man and I have known a great many troubles, but most of them never happened."
Yes.
And it's like, I think that when I look back on my life, it's like all the times that I ran the what if scenarios in my mind, or I worried about the various tracks that a particular action could take. And in many cases, none of them came to fruition. It wasn't even like, okay, well, one did, but all of these did not. It was like all of it seemed to be a waste of time.
Sure.
You know, and not always. I mean, there are times where that concern that gives way to worry actually gave way to very effective problem solving.
And preparation for
But
what was to
only
come.
if we moved past the worry.
Yes.
You know, and didn't stay.
And that's easier said than done.
Oh,
I feel
absolutely.
like.
Absolutely.
So my daughter, who's 6, recently had 3 teeth pulled. And I worried a lot about it. I couldn't sleep the night before. I was worried about how she was going to react. Was it going to be painful for her? I literally had to invite my dad into the dentist's office with me to provide me support so I could provide our daughter support. So,
And did she worry at all?
And she wasn't. And
Yep.
it's incredible. She was so brave and tough as nails, the courage that she had when she walked into that dentist's office, and the pride that she had when she walked out with 3 teeth that she was going to cash in with for the tooth fairy. It was remarkable. And I thought to myself as I left, wow, I just wasted so much time, a lot of time, worrying about worst case scenario. And you know, could I have spent that time doing something else? Probably.
Well, and when we think about worry, if we put it like in the time context, we worry about the past and the future. So we worry about perhaps mistakes we've made, things or actions or statements we've made in the past.
Yeah.
And again, worry tends to be this very general term that we're using, perhaps maybe regret is a better word there, but we're worrying about something that's already happened. And then the future, we worry about the what ifs, like your daughter's teeth being pulled, like what's to come, the unknown. And when we think of it in that context, we live in the present, but we really don't worry in the present. Even though the activity is occurring in the present, our mind is in the past or the future.
Right. We're either worrying what's to come, or we're worrying about something that happened.
Right,
And
that
should
just
I have done
happened.
something differently? You know, how was that received? And we're not necessarily living in
that
our
moment.
present
Well,
moment.
and the past is gone.
Yep. And
So
we can't do anything about it.
Not what happened. Now, we might be able to do something about how we react to it.
Sure.
And that's important to keep in mind. But we can't change what has already happened.
Right.
And with the future, we don't know what's going to happen. So again, we're spending all of this mental energy on an unknown, where if we were to focus on maybe perhaps planning, creating a plan where you have this activity in front of you or a problem in front of you to actually solve, rather than just spinning on the problem, then it becomes productive.
And
again.
then it decreases the anxiety associated with whatever it is, right? Because you feel more in control because you have a plan and you're taking some action steps.
And I'm glad you brought up that word anxiety, because I think, again, at least when I'm hearing people talk about worry and anxiety, we tend to interchange those two terms. And in common usage, that may not be a problem of any sort. But from a psychological perspective, they have very different meanings.
Oh, for sure.
If we say someone's worrying versus someone's anxious,
Yeah.
worrying is very different than anxiety.
But if it does become paralyzing and you have a difficult time, challenging time functioning because of whatever it is
That's
that
the
you might
anxiety.
be ruminating in, then that's the anxiety.
That's the anxiety. In fact, and let me see, I brought here this is kind of a nice Cliff Notes version that Guy Winch, who is a psychologist, had published in Psychology Today. This goes back about a year ago. It was back in 2016. But I love how succinctly he's able to just nail the differences when you're contrasting worrying to anxiety. Probably one of the easiest ways to think about it is anxiety can appear to be a really severe worrying. But there are signs that perhaps you're practice or your behaviors of worrying are going too far and should actually be something that maybe you should worry about the worrying that is occurring. One distinction that Guy Wench makes, and I think this is a really important one, is worry tends to happen in our heads, anxiety tends to happen in our bodies. And it's not that there's not a mental element to it, but if you start having pains, aches, and things physically in your body,
exhausted,
drained. You're tired, you're drained, the worrying's going too far.
Yeah.
Okay, at that point, because now you're starting to see a physical
and
side
that's why I
to
worry about worry, Miranda.
because it can go too far.
Absolutely.
Worry tends to be specific, while anxiety is more diffuse. Now, this is the one that was the most valuable for me when I first started thinking about worrying, and this is going back about 2 years ago. We have a psychology professor on campus, Dr. Katie Herzik.
I love her.
She's fabulous. She was on my radio show, Philosophy for Life, and she was talking about worry. That's one of her main areas of research. And when she drew the distinction, what really nailed it for me was this idea of how specific worry is. So if I use an example, I might worry, which I always do, about getting to the airport on time. Okay. Sometimes
I worry about that as well.
It's justified, sometimes it's not. Usually it's justified. I'm usually like flying in there at the last minute to make my flight. But I worry about that. That's a very specific, particular thing, and it's a particular context that passes. You know, either it's going to come to fruition that you've missed your plane or not.
You're going to get there or you're not.
But anxiety, if we think of this in a more general or vague context, someone who's anxious would not necessarily just simply worry about getting to the airport on time, but they may worry about traveling. And notice the difference that's already happening. If I want to try to solve the problem of arriving at the airport on time, I can set steps in place to make that happen. That's something that's manageable. Mm-hmm. If instead what I'm worrying about is travel,
the whole experience itself.
Well, it's not just flying. Now it's traveling by car, now it's traveling by bus. Now travel means so many different things. How do I, as an individual, even begin to put a plan in place, to overcome this? That's when we see worrying has moved beyond like even a possible productive item to something that now is anxiety. It's anxious.
And it feels more insurmountable than just planning to arrive at the airport because you called a taxi.
Yeah. So much more severe at that level. This is another one that I thought was an interesting contrast. Worry is verbally focused, whereas anxiety includes verbal thoughts, but also mental imagery. So we tend to have these pictures in our mind, so it goes beyond, we're now spinning scenarios that are in a way developing, they're taking on a life of their own. This is the part I found interesting about it.
And then our body reacts physically to that.
That's where I was going.
As if we're actually experiencing it.
And I don't have the specific physician that wrote this part, but they actually have conducted studies that there is a direct correlation to our cardiovascular reactions to emotional mental images. If they're positive, we tend to have a healthier heart. And if they're negative, and again, this is something that I have an interest in digging deeper into, because I think you're aware of this, that I was actually born with a hole in my heart. Mm-hmm. And so that physical side of the heart, and I had open heart surgery at a very young age, I found this extremely interesting, that how the mental images in our mind can directly impact the functioning of our cardiovascular system.
So
it's all interconnected.
Yeah, everything's connected.
So that one, personally, I'm going to dig a little deeper into and see what I can discover there. Worry often triggers problem solving. Anxiety does not. We've talked about that. Mm-hmm. Worry creates mild emotional distress. Anxiety can create severe emotional distress.
Debilitating.
Right. So we're not functioning anymore. Mm-hmm. Although I do think we have to be a little cautious that even at the mild emotional distress level, if we start spinning or ruminating, it's as unproductive, even though we may not be feeling it quite as severely. Worry is caused by more realistic concerns than anxiety, kind of like the being late to the airport example. Worry tends to be controllable. anxiety much less so. Not where if someone's anxious, we're done. There's nothing that can be done, but it's more difficult to come back from that than just simply worrying. And worrying tends to be a temporary state unless we allow ourselves to ruminate into it. When worrying starts to become more long-term, especially when you start to hit the point of worrying about worrying, that's when we want to consciously and very intentionally pull back from that.
Yes.
Because we're getting closer
and
now to
part of that
anxiety.
worrying though for me is to be conscious that I'm doing that, to pull back from it and say, okay, well, what can I take action on and what can't? So what do I need to release and let go? Because this is not going to be a part of my reality.
Live in that very intentionally.
Exactly. And to pull my mind back into the present moment. That has been so beneficial for me.
You know, you talk about controlling what we can and allowing those things that we can't control to just kind of fade away. I'm reminded of the ancient Greek philosopher Epictetus, who was a Stoic philosopher. He was born as a slave. And one of his famous quotes, and this won't be verbatim in the translation, but he basically said that if our bodies are bound but our soul is free, we are free. If our bodies are free but our soul is bound, we are a slave. And
goosebumps.
that's it.
So that's truth.
He really, even while, now he does eventually obtain his freedom. He's living in Rome at the time, but even while he was a slave, interestingly, these free philosophers who were citizens and considered, in this social economic status as superior, they were reading his philosophy. Because again, it seems like, I brought it with my mug today, thought is free, regardless of what our social economic standing is, regardless of where we're born in the world and the environments that we're thrust into. As rational, intellectual beings, any one of those individuals, regardless of where they're at, they could have that deep philosophical thought.
Yes.
It's not owned by a particular elite class, even though quite often a lot of our ancient writings came from elite class individuals because they had the time to write. They had the time to sit around and think and converse. But it was not something that was directly tied to the hardwiring of the brain. So Epictetus is like, he's one of them that always comes to mind, as do pretty much all the Stoic philosophers, because they held this view that we really can't control things that are external to us.
But we
can control how we react.
Yes, how we respond to those things. And
Right.
that's what I talk about all the time with my kids. You can't always control what happens to you on the playground, but you can control how you respond to those things.
Right. And learn from it. Again, going back to when we were talking about worrying about the past, we can be aware, we can be concerned and care about the past as long as we're continuing to kind of move forward. Learn lessons from that, change our behaviors if we weren't happy with our previous behaviors, but moving forward with
And
it.
setting intentions too. I feel like when you set your intention for the day, it's amazing how all of those things that you are looking towards and hoping for come to greet you.
Yeah, because you have control over that.
Absolutely, which is why I start my day off with meditation. And when I don't, when I hit snooze, sleep in, miss my mindful moment of the morning, all bets are off for me.
It's a different day, isn't it?
It's a very different day, yeah.
It's a different day. I'm reminded of the German philosopher Wittgenstein. He says that the world of those that are positive and happy really is different from the world of those that are not. That those intentions we put out there, it has an energy of sorts that's contagious. So negative energy, misery loves company. Positive energy, that positive, the happiness. We like to be around happy people. We're attracted to that as well.
Yes.
And so to be mindful of the energy that we're putting out.
And who you're surrounded by too, right? Who's in your circle. Each morning, I think I've shared this before, but each morning before my children go out into the world to school, I ask them to tell me who they are. I'm looking for I am love, so they can center themselves and ground themselves in who they are and everything that they have to offer the world. Sometimes I get some snarky, answers, but for the most part, I'm looking for I am love so that they are deeply aware of the power that they have, to really impact everyone around them, because the energy that you bring into a room is felt.
And I think that is such a powerful and positive way to start the day. And you have shared that with me before. So I decided to try it.
Oh, yeah?
So I asked my youngest, as he's getting
Brandon.
ready to head out the door, it's like, who are you? And he said, I am Penguin. I'm like, okay, that must be what happens when you're raised by a philosopher.
I love it.
And I looked at
great.
it, okay, let's
That's
go.
great. That's
so I'm not sure it
wonderful.
had the same impact, but he loves penguins, so that was his happy moment. Moving forward.
I'm sure that put him in a great space going in,
Well,
if
he
loves
literally
penguins.
has a T-shirt that says, always be yourself, unless you can be a penguin, then always
Yeah,
be a penguin.
then be a penguin.
Then be a penguin.
I love it.
Yeah, it went a little different direction
Yeah.
when I tried it. So I guess in the time we have remaining here, we probably ought to shift to how do we worry less? If worrying is something we really recognize that more often than not, it's not a positive thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it can spring worry, but most time it's not.
Right.
What can we do about it?
Yeah, what can we? I got my pen.
Okay,
You tell me.
So this
can I
is
do about
Dr.
worrying less?
Elizabeth Saunders Medlock. She's a psychologist. It was published a couple years ago, 2014, in HuffPost. And she's going to give us 10 kind of ways that we can worry less. First one I really love because she comes at it from two different perspectives, and that is changing your perspective. She calls it zooming out. So she says you can zoom out from your mind's eye. So in other words, how I even see the context of the situation. As soon as I zoom out, notice what happens. It's less about me. So the worrying that I'm running in my head on these tracks, it's usually a very narrow way of thinking.
Yeah.
When I start to look at the community and
See
the
the bigger
others,
picture.
and like an altruistic perspective, the worry has a hard time continuing in that space. The other way she talks about zooming out, though, is with time. And I like this one too. We worry about the past, about the present, or about the future, but we're living in the present. And it's usually one little nugget at a time that we just keep ruminating over.
Yes.
What she says is, again, zoom out. Whatever it is that we're worried about, what's that going to look like 10 years from now?
Yeah.
What's that going to look like 20 years?
In the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. And does
this
it
gonna be a
have the
problem?
same perspective when you
Yeah.
zoom out time-wise?
All right, zoom out.
So it's changing your
Note to
perspective.
self.
Yeah, zoom out especially if you start worrying about worrying.
Yeah.
Zoom out.
Really zoom way out.
This one you probably already do because I know you're a bit of a writer and journaler.
I do write
but she
about
says write about it.
Yeah.
Write it down.
Because it gets it out.
Yeah, it's off
Yeah.
your mind now
For sure.
and somewhere else.
Yeah.
Which another one she gives a little later on in this list that I liked is to give yourself permission, like literally schedule time to worry.
Yeah.
That if you know
Right.
worrying is something that's a regular part of what you do, and how you spend your time, just schedule a time. Okay, Fridays at 4, from 4 to 5, I'm going to worry.
And if someone needs you, you say, I'm sorry, this is my worry time.
This is my worry time.
Can't help you.
And what's interesting with that is more than likely when 4 o'clock rolls around,
Yeah.
you're going to look at it and go, this is absurd.
What am I doing?
It like, puts
Yeah.
it into perspective that worrying, again, not always, but more often than not, is a waste of time. So we
Yes.
wouldn't schedule it in our calendar. And yet we give away so much of our minutes and our hours and our days and even weeks at times to something we would not give enough credence to schedule it.
So this is interesting to me because if you schedule your time to worry and you say, oh wait, I have to worry about that during my scheduled time slot, by the time you get to the time slot, you probably aren't that worried about it anymore.
It's already moved outside
that's
of the
interesting.
time.
Yeah.
That's why I love that. It's like, and she literally
So
combines
simple.
that. It's like, write it down, put it on your calendar. This is when you're going to worry about
That's
that.
great.
And the perspective will already look different because time has passed. Work hard. This one I found interesting too because worry is so closely related to stress. That's kind of the negative relative to worry. And when we think about what the happiness research has taught us about stress, is that there's a happy balance.
Yes.
It's not really a negative thing all the time.
There's
most
a
of the time it
tipping
is.
point.
Right.
Right.
And so you can have too much stress. We clearly know what that feels like.
Mm-hmm.
But you can have too little stress and end up just bored. And neither one leads us to happiness. That's how I tend to view worrying. I do think you can definitely worry too much. Most of us are probably there, worrying too much. But we can worry too little. And it's where you were kind of at the start of the show. You know, it shows a lack of caring or not being vested.
If I don't worry about my 7th grader cooking when he's home alone, we could, have a house that burns down,
Right.
right?
And that's also
So I
something
do
you
worry
could do
about the house
something
burning
about
down.
it. You know, you
Right.
literally
We have
say,
a rule.
We
No
have a
eating.
talk. We have.
No eating for the hour that you're home alone. I do something about
here's
it.
one you're gonna love.
Okay.
Say no.
Oh, I'm really great at that,
That
Maria.
sounds so simple.
I'm a yes person,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
one of my Achilles
I'm
heels
working
as well.
on saying no, though.
Yeah, but a lot of worry comes from us taking on too much.
Yeah.
You know, and so literally being able to prioritize and at the outset tell people, no, I don't have time for this. I have a lot on my plate. I think it's very valuable.
Yeah.
You know, I just simply don't have time for it right now.
Okay, say no.
Yeah, so that can actually eliminate a lot of worry alongside of setting priorities.
Yeah.
You know, like, well, what things do we really need to get done and what things do I want to spend my time doing? Say stop. Now, this is directly to your own mind when you're worrying. So as you catch yourself, again, if we're working towards living these intentional lives,
Pull
you'll
yourself
have
out
these
of
moments
it.
where you go, oh, I'm worrying right now. I remember Jess and Maria on that show saying I shouldn't just worry, you know,
Tell
for the sake
myself,
of
"Stop
worrying.
worrying."
That literally
Yeah.
saying the word stop, and if you're not, like, let's say you're out in public and it would really look strange for you just to
Yeah.
yell out stop, they do say to mouth the word or say it in your head as the third
Yes.
option. But
Yeah.
ideally saying it out loud or at least mouthing it sends a message to your brain. And it's not what your brain expects because it's focused on whatever you're ruminating on mentally.
Right.
And so what it'll do is it jolts it a bit. And that jolt quite often
Brings
is
you
enough
back.
to pull you out
Yeah.
of the worry.
I do that.
You know, just like,
Yeah.
stop, it's enough, stop now.
Yeah. 'Cause
The
it's
other
not
thing that you
beneficial.
can do is just looking around. If you focus on different things, your mind wants to take in, you know, where that point of focus is, and it jolts it out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because although we like to think that we're multitaskers and that we're really great at it, we're really not that good at
Yeah.
multitasking.
No.
So the mind likes to focus on one thing at a time whenever possible.
And the mind likes to problem solve. So I think
Mm-hmm.
a lot of my worrying, at least, is my brain trying to figure out a solution. And sometimes there is no solution.
Right.
And that's when it's
Right.
harmful.
All right, I see, unfortunately, we're almost out of time.
We
This
could
went
talk
really
about
fast.
worry all day.
There's a lot to talk about. So I guess our lesson learned on this is to focus on the things that we have control over, not waste our time worrying about the things that fall outside of our control, and not necessarily viewing worry as entirely a negative thing. There is a positive side to worrying as long as it's used as a springboard to set a plan, you know, to look at what's the cause of that worry and immediately set our minds to resolving if it's a problem, the problem at hand, or creating a plan for whatever's causing us to want to go to that place of worry.
Great. Well, I took some good notes. So
All right,
thank
so
you, Maria.
I guess don't worry, be happy.
Oh, that's a great song.
Thanks for joining us.